The winter sky over Manhattan was velvet dark, stitched with 1,000 quiet lights. A whisper of snow drifted across Fifth Avenue, softening the edges of the city's relentless brilliance. Outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, black cars glided up to the steps like a procession of polished obsidian, each door opening to reveal New York's most celebrated figures: politicians, collectors, curators, and the descendants of dynasties whose names were carved into the city itself. And then, as if the night itself inhaled, she arrived. The museum's grand staircase, draped in crimson, became a stage. Amara Lewis stepped out of the sleek town car and into the crisp December air, with a calm grace that turned heads before the cameras even flashed. Her gown, a river of deep bronze silk that shimmered like firelight, flowed around her, tailored to whisper rather than shout. The high collar traced the line of her jaw, framing her face like a portrait. Every thread had been woven with intention, every detail carrying the quiet dignity of ancestry. The crowd's hums shifted: curiosity, recognition, disbelief. For many of them, Amara had once been a name uttered in murmurs, tucked behind closed boardroom doors. A scandal to some, a cautionary tale to others. But tonight, she was none of those things. She was a woman returned, standing in the heart of a world that once tried to erase her. Not as a guest begging for space at their table, but as someone who had built her own. She began to ascend the staircase. Light pooled at her feet with every step, and the whispering turned to silence, a reverent, electric stillness. Camera shutters fluttered like wings, catching her in motion. Somewhere in the crowd, an heiress lowered her champagne glass without realizing it. A gallery director forgot his carefully rehearsed smile. And beneath the golden glass of the museum's facade, portraits of long-dead benefactors seemed to watch her rise with their oil-painted eyes. Inside, the grand foyer blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers poured warmth across polished marble floors, and the music of a live orchestra unfurled through the air, soft strings and velvet piano, elegant and deliberate. It was a room built to crown power, not share it. Yet as Amara crossed the threshold, it felt, for the first time, like the room had been waiting for her. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence for the weight of the moment. A year ago, her name had been whispered with disdain. Tonight it was spoken with awe. A woman who had been told she didn't belong now moved as though the walls themselves had shifted to make space for her. Her hair, coiled into a crown of soft curls, caught the light like obsidian. Her jewelry, a pair of antique gold earrings passed down through generations of women who refused to disappear, gleamed as if proud to be here with her. She wasn't just dressed in elegance, she embodied it. She paused halfway across the foyer, allowing the space to breathe around her. Across the room, beneath a marble archway, stood faces she knew too well. Some belonged to critics who had dismissed her work as too political. Others belonged to patrons who had watched her fall and offered no hand to help her rise. But they were watching her now, not as an outcast, but as a storm they hadn't seen coming. And in that still, glowing instant, Amara didn't smile for them. She smiled for herself, for the night she had spent in silence, piecing herself back together, for the years she had spent proving her brilliance to people who measured worth by bloodlines and last names, for every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too dark, too loud, too bold to stand at the center of the room. This moment belonged to her. As the orchestra swelled and the master of ceremonies cleared his throat on the distant stage, the air seemed to bend around her presence. A red carpet had carried thousands before her, but tonight, it felt like she was walking on something much older, deeper, truer than velvet, the unbroken will of every soul who had refused to bow. Whispers began again, but they sounded different now. Her name moved through the crowd not as a rumor, but as a reckoning. Amara Lewis. The woman they called unfit, the woman who had vanished, the woman who had returned, not humbled but unstoppable. She exhaled softly, a single breath that carried the weight of everything she'd endured and the quiet power of everything she'd built. Her gaze swept the room, not to seek approval, but to claim her place. Tonight was not about revenge, it was about arrival. And somewhere in that golden-lit hall, among the guests who wore their power like armor, a man in a white bow tie caught sight of her. Elliot Whitmore, the man who had once loved her, then stood by while she was torn down. His expression flickered, shock, then awe, then something far smaller. She didn't need to look twice. That chapter had ended long before tonight. Amara straightened her shoulders, her every movement deliberate, as if each step rewrote history. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the sense that something had shifted forever. If you've ever had a moment where the world tried to tell you you didn't belong, and yet you walked into the room anyway, this story is for you. Because this night is only the beginning. If you feel the weight and beauty of that beginning, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow to witness the rest of Amara's journey unfold. The best stories aren't told from the top of the staircase. They're built one step at a time. 2 years earlier, the winter wind in Brooklyn had a different sound. Softer, lighter, full of possibility rather than weight. In a corner of the converted warehouse where the Haven Arts benefit auction was held, warm lights spilled across polished concrete floors. A jazz quartet played in a low corner, their melody wrapping itself like silk around conversations and champagne bubbles. Amara Lewis stood at the edge of the auction floor, a glass of Prosecco in her hand, and a calm, quiet smile that betrayed nothing of the excitement stirring inside her. She had been invited as the senior curator of the Manhattan Arts Institute to bid on behalf of the museum. But she wasn't just here to buy. She was here to win. On the far side of the room, under a suspended installation of gold-threaded lanterns, stood the piece she had come for. A rare mid-century bronze sculpture by Adewale Ajayi, one of Nigeria's most celebrated post-colonial artists. It was more than a sculpture. It was history made tangible. The artist's hands had given shape to a moment of rebellion, a whisper of freedom cast in metal. Around the piece, collectors hovered like moths circling a flame, their conversations a tapestry of cultured whispers. It was there, beneath the warm glow of the lanterns, that Amara saw him for the first time. Elliot Whitmore. He was taller than most of the room, his tuxedo tailored with that subtle precision that only old money could carry. His hair, a soft winter gold, was swept back carelessly, as though elegance had always come too easily to him. He laughed at something an older patron said, and the sound carried. A warm, practiced sound, the kind that could make people lean closer without realizing they'd stepped toward the fire. Their eyes met across the crowd, not in a cinematic instant of thunder and destiny, but in something quieter, steadier. She held his gaze without lowering hers, and for a heartbeat, he stopped mid-sentence. It wasn't her dress or her poise that caught him, it was the way she stood, unapologetically present, unafraid to claim space in a room that had never been built for her. The auction began with polite applause. Amara found herself seated at table 12, a modest position compared to the front rows where the board members and titans of industry held court. Elliot was 3 rows ahead, surrounded by the confident ease of men who had never known what it meant to ask permission to exist. The sculpture came up mid-program, announced with reverence. Lot 19, the auctioneer intoned. Adewale Ajayi's Daughter of Fire, 1968. The lights dimmed slightly, and the spotlight wrapped the sculpture in a warm embrace. The first bid came quickly. 50,000, 70, 90. Elliot raised his paddle at 120 with the casual flick of someone buying a vintage car. Amara's heart steadied. She raised hers at 140. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Heads turned, whispers passed like paper notes through a classroom. 160, Elliot countered. She waited 2 beats, not long enough to look hesitant, but just enough to feel deliberate, and raised again. 180. And then, for the first time, he looked back at her. Not the cursory glance of a competitor, but the assessing gaze of someone intrigued. His lips curved, not into a smirk, but into the faintest ghost of a smile. 200, 220, 250. The numbers rose like a waltz, back and forth, elegant and relentless. It wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a conversation neither of them spoke aloud. The auctioneer's voice was a drumbeat, but between them stretched a line of invisible tension, sharp, thrilling, alive. When the final hammer fell at $300,000, Amara's paddle was still in the air. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Some smiled politely, others frowned. But Elliot leaned back in his chair and laughed quietly to himself, as if he'd just lost the most delightful game he'd ever played. Later, as she examined the sculpture up close, its bronze contours catching the soft light like fire on water, she heard the unmistakable sound of leather soles behind her. "I've never met someone who could make losing feel like winning," a low, warm voice said. Amara turned. Elliot stood a breath away, the soft fragrance of cedar and winter cologne folding into the air between them. Up close, his features were even sharper than they'd appeared across the room. But his gaze held a kind of disarming curiosity she hadn't expected. "It wasn't personal," she replied evenly. "Good," he said, tilting his head slightly, "because I'd hate to think our first encounter was a declaration of war." Her lips curved, just slightly. "Some wars are worth fighting." Elliot laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that didn't belong to polished society galas. "Then maybe I'll have to start showing up to more of them." That night unfolded like silk ribbon between fingers, slow, effortless, wrapping around them without either realizing it. They wandered through the exhibition rooms together, pausing before paintings like co-conspirators sharing secrets. He asked her about Ajayi's technique, about what she saw when she looked at the sculpture. And she, against her better judgment, answered. She told him about the artist's life, the moment of rebellion that shaped the piece, the quiet resistance encoded in every curve of bronze. And when she spoke, Elliot didn't just listen. He watched her, as though each word added something new to the room. By the end of the evening, the air outside had turned crisp and starry. They stood beneath a street lamp, its glow softening the city's edges. Elliot slipped his hands into his coat pockets, looking at her the way men look at things they didn't know they needed until they found them. "I don't usually lose auctions," he said softly. "Then I guess tonight was a first," she replied. "I hope not the last." It wasn't a grand declaration, just a single sentence, but it lingered in the space between them like warm breath on a winter night. And when she walked away, her heels tapping softly against the pavement, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. The fairy tale had already begun. The first snowfall of the season had dusted Manhattan in pale silver the night Amara crossed the threshold of the Whitmore townhouse. The Upper East Side glimmered with restrained opulence, brownstone facades draped in soft white, carriage lamps burning gold in the cold. Elliot had taken her hand on the steps, his fingers warm through his leather gloves, as if to say without words, "I'm glad you're here." The door opened before they clock. A butler in a black tailcoat stepped aside with military precision, and the world inside unfurled in polished marble and centuries-old portraits. The Whitmore home did not simply speak of wealth. It carried it like a birthright. Every corner seemed to declare that it had belonged to the same family for generations. Amara had grown up in the warm chaos of a small home in Atlanta, a place of color, music, and the laughter of a mother who worked double shifts but never let the world make her small. Here, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of rest, but of judgment waiting politely in the corner. "Come in," Elliot murmured, his voice gentle against the hush. He offered her a smile she'd once trusted like sunlight. She removed her coat, smoothing down the fabric of her deep emerald dress, chosen carefully, not too formal, not too casual, a perfect balance. She had rehearsed this evening in her head a dozen times. First family dinner, polite conversation, shared smiles. She had imagined warmth, or at least the hope of it. She hadn't imagined the weight of the walls. The dining room was a cathedral of candlelight. A long mahogany table stretched almost absurdly far, flanked by high-backed chairs upholstered in crimson. At its head sat Margaret Whitmore, Elliot's mother, elegant, pristine, wrapped in pale silk that caught the light like frost. Beside her, Richard Whitmore, his father, adjusted his cufflinks with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to control. "Mother, father," Elliot began, that charming ease in his voice. "This is Amara Lewis." Margaret's smile was as graceful as it was sharp. "Amara," she repeated, savoring the syllables as though rolling an unfamiliar wine over her tongue. "How lovely to finally meet you. Elliot has spoken so highly of you." "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Whitmore," Amara said, keeping her voice smooth, warm, steady. They sat. Crystal glimmered. Porcelain whispered softly as dishes were laid before them. A string quartet played faintly through hidden speakers, delicate and precise. For a while, the conversation moved politely, like dancers in a waltz where everyone already knew the steps. Elliot spoke about their recent trip to Boston. Richard asked about her work at the Manhattan Arts Institute. She answered with careful poise, though she felt the invisible gaze of the portraits behind her, the Whitmores of another century, all pale faces in oil paint, staring down from gilt frames. And then, Margaret tilted her head just slightly. "Amara," she said lightly, "Elliot mentioned that your family is from Georgia. But where are your people from originally?" The words were wrapped in silk. Their edges were anything but. Amara lifted her wineglass, buying herself half a second. "My mother's family has been in the States for 4 generations," she replied evenly. "Atlanta. My father's side is from New Orleans." "Ah," Margaret said softly, as if satisfied. "How? Rich with history." Richard cleared his throat with a faint, approving rumble. "Elliot, you always did appreciate color in your circles," he said, the word dressed as a compliment but weighted like a stone. Elliot's hand tensed beneath the tablecloth. She felt it, a subtle shift, but he said nothing. The string music filled the silence that followed. The Whitmore's butler refilled their glasses with quiet efficiency, and the world outside, the snow, the city, felt impossibly far away. "So," Margaret continued, her smile frozen in place, "the art world seems to be changing so quickly. Diversifying, I suppose one might say." "One might," Amara answered. "In my day," Margaret went on, "there was such clarity. Standards were clear. Now," she gestured vaguely, her hand cutting through the air like a well-manicured blade, "so many new perspectives. It must be a fascinating time for someone like you." The words landed softly, like powder on fresh snow, but beneath the surface, they stung. "Someone like you. Not someone like Elliot, not someone like us." Amara met Margaret's eyes and smiled with quiet steel. "It is," she said, "a fascinating time. There's a certain beauty in what happens when old doors open and new voices step through." Margaret's smile faltered for the briefest moment, like fine porcelain catching a hairline crack. Richard shifted in his chair, clearing his throat again. Elliot's fingers tightened around his fork, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke of other things. Neutral, harmless things. Dinner continued, course after course, champagne and polite laughter. But beneath every word, beneath every carefully placed smile, the air between them was threaded with the same unspoken truth. They were letting her in just far enough to remind her she didn't belong. Later, when they stepped out into the snow-dusted night, the warmth of Elliot's townhouse behind them and the sharp city air ahead, Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "They were polite," she said finally, her voice quiet. Elliot shoved his hands in his pockets. "They were," he agreed, though something tight flickered across his features. "They're old-fashioned. But they'll come around." She looked at him then. Not the charming man from the auction, not the lover who whispered history into her skin, but the man who lived inside those walls. "Will they?" she asked softly. Elliot smiled, but it wasn't the bright, effortless smile she knew. It was thin, careful. "They just need time to understand." The snow crunched softly beneath their feet as they walked down the steps. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. In that quiet, crystalline moment, a truth settled somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Elliot loved her. She didn't doubt that. But love alone did not melt centuries of marble. And as they stepped into the waiting car, the night wrapped itself around them. Not like a promise, but like a question left unanswered. March came to Manhattan, cold and brittle. The kind of morning that glazed the city in light and made even the most familiar streets feel distant. Amara woke before dawn, brushed her fingertips across a stack of note cards, and practiced the order of her presentation aloud. Dates, provenance, conservation budgets, projected attendance, school partnerships. The African Diaspora Art Initiative had been her quiet labor for months, a constellation of exhibitions and educational programs tied to one central acquisition. A collection of rare West and East African works drawn from private holdings, ready to be studied, restored, and finally seen. She arrived at the Manhattan Arts Institute while the marble lobby was still echoing with its first footsteps. In her office, the city hummed through the window. She set the slide deck in careful sequence, aligned the proposal binder with the edge of the desk, and allowed herself a small smile. It was not just scholarship. It was architecture, the building of a public good out of fragments the world had looked away from for too long. At 8:14, an email arrived. Subject line, Pledge Amendment, Whitmore Family Foundation. The message was brief. A strategic realignment of philanthropic priorities, a request to pause disbursements on pledged funds. A final line so spare it almost vanished. Effective immediately. She read it twice, then a third time. The Whitmore Foundation, Elliot's family's donor-advised fund, was the cornerstone of her matching grant structure. Without that match, the consortium of smaller donors would withdraw in sequence. It was not just a domino. It was the first stone removed from an arch. Her phone vibrated. Julian Hart, the Institute's director. "Can you come to the boardroom?" he asked. The practiced neutrality of his voice told her everything. The boardroom was a long rectangle of winter light in lacquered wood, glass walls opening to the skyline like a held breath. Half the trustees were already seated. Counsel stood at the end of the table, a neat folder arranged precisely before her. Amara placed her binder down and kept her hands still. Julian did not sit. "The Whitmore Foundation has rescinded their pledge," he said, using a verb that tasted like metal. "Without it, our finance committee cannot certify this acquisition. We have reviewed the contingency plans you proposed, but the covenants with our bondholders." He paused, a gentleness passing through his expression like shade. "We can't proceed." Amara nodded once. "Then we move the timeline," she said, steady. "We can go public with the collection's significance, open a campaign at smaller tiers, bring in school districts as partners. The projections still hold if we scale the restoration over 2 fiscal years." A trustee, a woman with a braid of pearls and a reputation for caution, folded her hands. "The optics," she said softly. "There has been concern that this direction is more advocacy than art. Our audience expects certain standards." "Excellence is the standard," Amara replied. "The work meets every one of our criteria. We have conservation reports, peer reviews, provenance traced with court-admissible documentation. If the concern is optics, it is not scholarly." Counsel slid the folder forward, as if it weighed nothing. "There's another issue. We received a letter from Whitmore Enterprises this morning." She didn't say from Richard Whitmore. She didn't need to. "They cite potential conflicts related to your personal relationship with Mr. Elliot Whitmore, implying influence over institutional decisions. The letter recommends personnel changes to restore confidence in fiduciary oversight." The words arranged themselves into a clean, quiet weapon. Amara remembered the early days when the Institute had wooed her with talk of courage, of leadership. The same men and women now avoided her eyes. "How much of our operating budget is tied to Whitmore-linked entities?" Amara asked, and the room bowed slightly to the practical truth. 38%, Julian said, the number catching in his throat. "And the remainder of the funding ladder," she continued, "is contingent on their match." "Much of it," he admitted. "The matching language is explicit." Silence pressed against the glass. "We are prepared to offer a severance package," Counsel said carefully, opening the folder. 12 months' salary, benefits for 6, and a mutual non-disparagement clause. "We are not making a judgment about the quality of your work. This is about institutional stability. If we fight, we lose programs, staff, possibly accreditation." The folder's pages breathed like a small animal in her periphery. Amara's mind moved with engineer's precision through what-ifs. A wrongful termination suit. Discovery that would cost the Institute millions. A public relations war against a family that owned half of Midtown through layered LLCs. She pictured spreadsheets, not outrage, grants frozen. A capital campaign strangled in its crib. In some battles, even victory leaves ruins. "Is Elliot aware?" she asked, the name steady, the air around it not. Julian's glance toward the door was involuntary. "He's here," he said. The door opened as if it had been listening. Elliot stepped into the room in a navy suit, the cut too perfect to be new. His face was the same and not the same, the familiar beloved lines holding a composure that looked like absence. Behind him, Richard Whitmore didn't bother to enter fully. He remained framed by the doorway, a figure of cool patience in a winter coat. Elliot took a seat 2 chairs down, as if proximity could be polite without being brave. "This is difficult," he began, and the word broke in the middle. Amara did not look at Richard. She did not look at counsel, or the trustee with the pearls, or the skyline holding its bright, indifferent breath. She looked at Elliot and asked the smallest question that still contained the whole world. "Did you fight this?" He swallowed. "I advocated for time, for a pause. There are legacy considerations. My father, our board, feels the Institute has shifted from curation to correction," Richard said from the doorway, the single word dry as paper, "to activism." Amara did not turn. "Activism," she repeated gently, the syllables landing like feathers on stone. "The work includes 15th century brass, 19th century textiles, carved ivory pre-ban, manuscripts authenticated by 3 independent scholars. If that is activism, then truth is activism." Richard's silence said, "Truth is what we underwrite." Elliot's hands were clasped together, knuckles blanched. "It isn't personal," he said, and the sentence was so patently untrue, the room seemed to flinch. "It's governance. We have responsibilities." "To what?" Amara asked. "To standards or to comfort?" He did not answer. Time did something strange then. It thinned and widened. She saw, with unnerving clarity, the pattern every woman she admired had recognized too late. The moment when the man who adored her in private measured her in public against the ledger of his inheritance and set her on the wrong side of the decimal. Julian's voice was very soft. "If you accept the package, we can announce a transition in vision. You would leave with dignity." The word dignity trembled, not because it was insincere, but because it had been purchased too many times. Amara reached for the folder and closed it. The movement was simple, almost tender. "I won't sign your silence," she said, "but I will leave. I won't burn the institution I love to prove that I was right." Something like relief, something like shame, crossed more than one face. She stood. No one stopped her. At the door, she met Elliot's eyes one last time. All the evenings on rooftops, the deli coffee at midnight, the private awe in a small back room of a museum, the shared reverence for beauty, rushed through her and receded like a tide that had forgotten how to return. "Legacy," she said softly, "is not what you inherit. It's what you choose." He didn't follow her. Downstairs, HR waited with a cardboard box and a kindness that felt like a bandage. A guard with apologetic eyes walked her past the lobby where school children pressed their faces to glass cases and learned to name colors by their first astonishment. Outside, March sun slid off the facades like water. The city kept moving. Taxis, steam, a woman laughing into her scarf as if the air had told her a secret. Amara set the box on the curb and watched her breath thread into the cold. She felt the absence before she felt the pain, the hollow where life had been, the quiet before a heart decides it can keep going. In those few still seconds, grief and clarity braided themselves together until they were the same rope, the one she would use to climb. She picked up the box. The wind lifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of something green and distant. Spring, stubborn and inevitable, was somewhere just beyond the corner. The first days after the boardroom felt like living underwater. Sound arrived dulled, light broke into untrustworthy fragments, and movement itself required a kind of will that used to come unasked. Amara learned the shapes of silence in her small Harlem walk-up, the radiator's uneven breath, the stubborn window that refused to seal, the upstairs neighbor pacing through midnight like a metronome set to grief. She folded her severance letter into a drawer she didn't open. She closed the email tab faster than the rejections could refresh. "We admire your vision but cannot proceed at this time." Until that phrase threaded itself through the hours like a refrain. She was careful with money now. The coffee maker became a ceremony. She rationed the good beans like perfume. The green coat she loved, its seams softened by winter after winter, hung on a chair like a friend keeping watch. On the wall above her desk, maps of exhibitions that would never be mounted gathered a filigree of pushpins and string, bright constellations in a sky that no longer knew their names. She did not cry. It surprised her. Perhaps the body knows when tears would drown more than cleanse. Instead, she walked, Lenox to Frederick Douglass, up to 145th and back down again, letting the city feed her what it could. A trumpet practicing 3 floors up, the cinnamon shock of a bakery opening its door, a toddler in a wool hat pointing at pigeons like miracles. Harlem, generous even when it is tired, folded her in with the indifferent tenderness of a river that keeps moving. On the 4th afternoon, the phone lit with her mother's name. "Baby," her mother said, no greeting, just a temperature taken by listening. "Come eat. You sound like an empty room." They met at a cafe on a corner, where the awning remembered summer. Her mother, Renee, who had nursed half a city through its ordinary disasters and still found room for gentleness, ordered soup for both of them without asking. Up close, she examined Amara the way she had when scraped knees were still a crisis. Not for damage, but for what would heal. "I'm not broken," Amara said lightly. "I know," Renee replied, "but even knives need sharpening." They ate, and in the eating, the world returned to its proper size. When the soup had dwindled and the steam no longer kissed their faces, Renee reached across the table and folded Amara's hand in both of hers. "You built something beautiful and they set fire to it," she said, voice level. "What's left?" "Char," Amara said, "and paperwork." Renee's mouth tipped. "Char is where gardens begin." A laugh escaped, brief, incredulous, grateful. "I don't have land, Mama. I have 600 square feet and a view of a brick wall." "Land is a promise, not a parcel," Renee said. "Find the promise." 2 days later, promise arrived in the shape of a woman with a quiet smile and a memory like a museum. Desta Mekanin ran a small Ethiopian restaurant on a side street that still smelled of last night's rains. But before visas and kitchens and the arithmetic of rent, she had been a curator in Addis Ababa, guardian to manuscripts that would make scholars lean closer without realizing they'd stopped breathing. "I hear you lost your house," Desta said, setting a plate of injera and doro wat on the table without ceremony. "So did I, once. I built a different one." Amara traced the linen weave with her fingertip. "I didn't just lose mine. It was taken, with signatures." "Then don't knock on the same door," Desta replied, as if the answer had been waiting on the shelf for years. "I know a family." They arrived with 2 suitcases and 12 artifacts they could not leave behind. They were offered insult for appraisals and doubt for provenance. "They are tired. I think you could be rest." They met in a storage unit that remembered summers older than the city's newest money. Someone had taken care. Humidity monitors, padded crates, a careful logic to the stacking. And Amara felt the familiar lift begin in her chest, the hush that arrives when history opens its palm and says, "Look." Ivory, carved before laws were a glimmer, now anchored in documentation like a harbor. Textiles dyed with a patience no machine could counterfeit. Brass that had learned the language of human hands and never forgotten. "Where did they get these?" she asked, already knowing the answer was neither simple nor singular. "From the country that made them," Desta said. "Before the country had to run." The family, 3 generations, the youngest translating when English stumbled, sat on folding chairs and watched Amara as one might watch a doctor. She spoke not in numbers first, but in names. The weavers, the kingship rituals, the way certain patterns were not decoration but sentence. She spoke of custody, not possession, partnership, not purchase. When the conversation turned to money, she did not flinch. When it turned to trust, she leaned forward and asked what they needed in order to sleep. By evening, they had an agreement written in plain language and signed with tea still warm in their cups. Not a sale, a stewardship, proceeds shared, pieces displayed with the dignity of their origin, research open to the children of the people who had once touched them first. Back in her apartment, she spread papers across the floor, permit applications, a lease for a warehouse in Bushwick she could almost afford, a rough budget with numbers that required miracles and good shoes. She drew columns for what she had: scholarship, community, the artifacts, Her name hard-won. And what she didn't: capital, staff, time. She made lists that would have frightened smaller hopes. Department of Buildings filings, insurance quotes, a conversation with a banker who would smile sadly at her projections and call them ambitious, like a diagnosis. The banker did exactly that 3 days later. The loan died gently in a glass office that looked out over a city of institutions impressed with themselves. On the sidewalk, she let the denial sit beside her like an inelegant companion, and then texted Desta, "We'll do this another way." That night, she drafted a prospectus for community investment bonds at denominations that made sense for the neighborhood. $50, $100, $500, with returns not only in interest but in invitations. Workshops, such children's classes named for grandmothers. She wrote a governance charter for a board that would include artists, teachers, archivists, and elders whose credentials were not framed but lived. She called the landlord of the warehouse and negotiated months 1 and 2 as billed out with partial rent. Month 3 on a cliff she dared herself to reach. She met with a council member's aide and left with nothing but a list of forms and the knowledge that knots untie slower than dreams. She called a journalist she once trusted and said the quiet part aloud. "I'm not opening a gallery. I'm opening a door." At night, she lay awake and counted, not sheep but chairs. How many for the first opening? How many for the children's story hour? How many for the elders who would tire but refuse to leave? In the mornings, she bought bolts of muslin and rented lights with the insurance rider she read twice. She recruited volunteers with the kind of promise no paycheck can purchase. Come, build home. When fear arrived, and it did, punctual and dressed well, she treated it like weather, acknowledged, prepared for, refused as prophecy. On a Thursday, pale with rain, she visited the storage unit alone and stood with the artifacts in the hush that humans make when confronted with their own continuities. She spoke to them softly, ridiculous and sincere. "We are going to do right by you. We are going to make you visible without making you spectacle." On Friday, Renee came to the warehouse with a tin of cornbread and a first aid kit, because mothers understand that building anything sacred requires both. They ate standing up, smiling for no reason except the discovery that hunger and hope make good company. When they finished, Renee set the tin down and took Amara's face in both hands, as if aligning a compass. "You sound like a person again," she said. "I feel like ground again," Amara answered. She turned back to the floor plan taped to the wall. The circulation arrows, the sight lines, the small corner marked listening room. The name she had written across the first page, in ink darker than doubt, watched her with a steadiness that felt like kin. The bridge gallery. Rock bottom, she understood, was not a level, but a clarity, the clean bedrock beneath the rubble. From here, there was nothing left to protect except the truth. From here, the only direction worth choosing was up. Spring crept into Brooklyn quietly, as if unsure it was welcome. It threaded itself through the cracked sidewalks of Bushwick, through the stubborn wildflowers that grew between warehouse bricks, through the light that softened the sharp corners of metal shutters. On Jefferson Street, where the rumble of freight trains and the laughter of children lived side by side, a gray warehouse waited like a sleeping giant. Its walls carried years of silence, but not for much longer. Amara unlocked the door one April morning with hands that no longer trembled when they reached for something new. The space was cavernous and imperfect, concrete floors pitted with time, beams like the ribs of some great animal overhead, and windows so dusty the sunlight arrived as a pale gold fog. But to her, it was a cathedral, not one built for marble saints or gilt frames, but for stories, real ones, heavy and alive. She spread the blueprints across an old folding table and stood there for a long moment, listening to the echo of her own breathing. This was where the Bridge Gallery would live, not as a polished monument to what the city already understood, but as a living room for the voices it had long ignored. The work began slowly, almost shyly. A handful of volunteers showed up that first week. An art student with paint under his nails, an Eritrean grandmother who insisted on bringing lunch for everyone, 2 dancers who believed movement itself could be architecture. Desta came every morning, sleeves rolled, laughter sharp and unbending. Renee, Amara's mother, stitched fabric banners at a corner table as if she'd always belonged there. Together, they swept years of dust into piles and wheeled it out in rusted bins. They patched the floor, sealed the roof, coaxed reluctant windows into opening again. The air shifted with each layer of dust they carried out. A clearing, a quieting, as if the walls themselves recognized the hands rebuilding them. Amara spent nights drafting grant applications on the warehouse floor, the hum of the city filtering through cracked glass. She wrote not like a petitioner, but like an architect, describing light, community, and legacy with the precision of someone who had already decided that the future was non-negotiable. Some rejections came swiftly, but others, small arts councils, a diaspora foundation in D.C., a university research grant, said yes. Each yes stitched a new piece into the quilt of possibility. The community bonds began to take shape. Local shop owners invested $50 here. A bakery offered monthly donations. A barber on Malcolm X Boulevard handed her a crumpled envelope with quiet pride. The gallery wasn't rising on a single fortune. It was rising on many hands, steady and determined. When the artifacts finally arrived, the entire space seemed to still. The crates were opened one by one, and time itself exhaled into the room. Bronze glimmered softly, its surface touched by centuries of hands. Carved ivory whispered of old kingdoms and vanished roads. The woven textiles unfurled like rivers, their colors richer than the afternoon sun. Amara knelt before them, not as a conqueror claiming treasure, but as a daughter returning to something older than her own name. These were not objects to be possessed. They were witnesses, and now they would speak again. She worked with conservators and historians, some seasoned, others young and fierce with new ideas, to build the exhibits. They decided against velvet ropes and sterile white walls. Instead, they designed spaces that breathed. Each piece was paired with recordings of elders telling its story in their own tongues. Translations whispered softly through speakers. Touch panels allowed children to trace patterns in cloth and understand that beauty had always been theirs. At the heart of the gallery, Amara designed a circle of low benches beneath a suspended lantern, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't an exhibition space. It was a listening room. She wanted people to sit there and remember that history isn't something that happens far away. It is something that lives in the air between us. By midsummer, word had spread, not in glossy magazines, but in kitchens, churches, barbershops, and stoops. Families brought their children to watch the walls transform. Artists offered their work for the inaugural show. Musicians came to rehearse in the evenings, their sound curling through the rafters like a blessing. The warehouse was no longer silent. It pulsed with footsteps and language and song. One evening, as the sun melted into the skyline, Amara stood at the far end of the gallery and watched Desta arrange fresh flowers beside a case of ancient brass. The windows glowed amber. Volunteers were laughing over mismeasured fabric. Her mother sat with a group of neighborhood girls, showing them how to stitch patterns that were older than the city itself. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt a quiet, bone-deep steadiness, an anchor, not a chain. She had not fought her way back into their world. She had built her own. The final inspection came in July. The fire marshal tapped his pen against his clipboard and squinted at the exit signs. A building inspector ran her palm along the railing and nodded once. The permits were signed in ink that smelled faintly of bureaucracy and relief. And then, with the same hands that had once packed away the last of her office, Amara turned the key to lock the gallery as its rightful owner. The night before opening, the space was empty except for her. She walked through each room slowly, listening. The artifacts gleamed softly in their cases, their shadows stretching long across the floor. She ran her fingertips along a textile's protective glass, and the warmth of the fabric seemed to hum beneath her skin. She thought of Elliot then, not with longing, but with clarity. The boardroom, the silence, the way the world of marble houses had measured her worth and found it wanting. How small that world seemed now, compared to the pulse of this one. Outside, Brooklyn's night wrapped itself around the warehouse. A passing train shuttered the walls, and the artifacts did not tremble. They belonged. Amara stood in the listening room, her hands tucked into the pockets of her paint-splattered jeans, and exhaled. She had spent months climbing out of the ashes of their rejection. But here, beneath the dim lantern light, she understood something simpler and larger. This had never been about fighting for a seat at their table. It was about building a table they could not claim, could not own, could not erase. When she turned off the lights, the room held its breath, a heartbeat between what was and what was about to begin. December returned to Manhattan with its lacquered chill and hush of velvet. Snow threaded itself through the oaks along Fifth Avenue, and the city, always too alive to sleep, seemed for one restrained evening to hold its breath. The Metropolitan Museum blazed against the winter night, every column lit as if the building itself were a candelabrum raised to the sky. Cars paused like commas along the curb. Chandeliers trembled behind high windows. A red carpet unspooled down the steps as though the year itself were bowing to its last, most ceremonious sentence. Amara's taxi slid to a stop behind a vintage Packard. For a beat, she watched the reflections gather on the glass. Camera blooms, a pale sweep of fur, the slow lift of a doorman's gloved hand. Then she stepped out into the cold and felt the city reintroduce her, first with the brittle kiss of air on her cheek, then with the recognition that moved across the barricade like a tide changing its mind. Her gown was a quiet thunder. Cut close, it fell in a straight, deliberate line, black silk with an undercurrent of indigo that revealed itself only when the light found it, like the night answering the sea. At the neckline, a fine collar of hammered gold rested against her skin, more talisman than jewelry. A Ghanaian-American designer had made it for her with a patience that felt like blessing. Each seam had been laid with the certitude that a woman might carry history as easily as grace. She did not rush. Each step was an unhurried verb. The cameras went from interested to intent. Names rode the air, hers among them, arriving not as rumor but as recognition. Inside the rotating doors, heat lifted against her collarbone. The marble breathed its old, expensive breath. Music curled through the foyer. Strings, the clean arch of a clarinet. The room had been arranged the way power arranges itself, a choreography of pauses and glances, of laughter that opened just far enough to reveal teeth. Miss Lewis, a man with silver hair and a golden lapel pin approached, his smile diplomatic and exact. On behalf of the Royal Foundation, welcome. We're honored you could join us. His handshake was warm, his eyes measured and, unexpectedly, sincere. I toured the bridge last week, he added, lowering his voice as if confiding a secret to the marble. It felt less like a gallery than a country returning to its own borders. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Word of the bridge's first year had traveled in a way even she had not anticipated. Newspapers that once overlooked her now sent photographers to document children seated on low benches, with their palms against the hum of history. Scholars asked to be assigned research hours. Grandparents asked for chairs near the listening room. The city, which had never pretended to be one thing, found in her rooms an old truth it had long mispronounced. She moved through the foyer with practiced ease, but nothing about the night felt rehearsed. The director of a museum that had canceled a meeting with her the previous winter stepped into her path, his smile professionally contrite. Ms. Lewis, he began, I've been wanting to enjoy the evening, she said gently, and kept walking. It was not unkindness, only economy. Near the staircase, a gilded sweep that had ferried fortunes and mistakes for a century, she saw him. Elliot Whitmore stood against a column with a glass he wasn't drinking. White tie, impeccable. A lock of hair refusing obedience at his temple, as if some small part of him remembered being human. He had the look of a man who had come costumed as himself and found the part ill-fitting. For a moment, the music seemed to lower its shoulder around them, making a corridor out of noise. He saw her, and the world inside his face rearranged. Wonder, then regret, then the quick defensive architecture of a practiced smile. He took one step forward, then another, until the decorum of the evening delivered him to her as if on a silver tray. Amara, he said, quietly enough that her name sounded like a confession. You look... He stopped, choosing honesty over poetry. You look like yourself. More. She considered him with a calm that had taken a long winter to learn. Good evening, Elliot. I read about the bridge, he went on. the words threading out of him. My mother sent me the article and, well, she didn't understand it. I did. Understanding is a beginning, she said, not to comfort but because it was true. His gaze searched her, then flinched from finding what it sought. I should have fought harder, he said, as if the admission could soften the past by naming it. I told myself legacy meant guardianship. I mistook it for obedience. A kindness rose in her like breath, then passed. Legacies do that to people. She let silence rest between them, steady as a hand on a fevered brow. We're both standing in what we chose. I know, he said. His smile, the first real one of the night, came and went like weather. I'm glad you chose this. So am I. Someone called her name from the mezzanine, the syllables catching and gleaming as they fell. A staffer in black approached with the efficient grace of those who direct evenings that must not falter. Ms. Lewis, we're seating now. Elliot stepped back. Congratulations, he said simply. Take care, Elliot. She turned, and the moment closed like a well-written line. At the base of the staircase, she paused. The marble had a way of amplifying footsteps into biography. She placed her hand on the rail, cool, polished by 1,000 ascents, and felt nothing like trembling. Above her, the galleries opened like lungs. The procession into the great hall moved as ceremony always does, silently enforcing its own logic. Place cards glittered at tables like small constellations, naming who mattered to whom. Amara found her seat near the stage. A woman she admired slid into the chair beside her and squeezed her hand with conspiratorial glee. Across the room, she found faces that had once been doors. Some tilted in acknowledgement, some pretended to be studying the floral arrangements. None of it touched her. The orchestra gathered itself, and the evening, rostered, rehearsed, inevitable, began. Between courses, a montage unfurled on high screens. Children in paper crowns tracing adinkra symbols. An elder in cobalt blue speaking the name of a long-ago queen. Scholars bent like question marks over manuscripts once thought lost. The camera panned across the bridge's listening room, empty except for light, then filled, in the next cut, with 3 generations aligned on a bench, their silhouettes a single story. A murmur moved through the room that wasn't quite applause. It was quieter, older. The chair of the foundation rose. Her voice had the clean ring of crystal. She spoke of cities as archives, and of archives as living things, of how scholarship falters when it forgets to kneel and listen. She spoke Amara's name last, as if saving a chord to resolve the melody. Amara felt the air take her measure, and found that she had nothing left to prove to it. In the balcony's shadow, she caught a final, stray vignette. Richard Whitmore at a table of men in black coats, his posture exact, his mouth a firm line. He clapped when others clapped. When the screens showed a child's hand learning to spell an ancestor's name, his eyes slid away, as though the intimacy embarrassed him. She regarded him the way a scholar regards a stubborn footnote, necessary to cite, unnecessary to love. The program moved toward its hinge. A steward bent to her ear. When your name is announced, take the right stairs to the stage. She nodded. The hall seemed to draw her forward on a ribbon of sound. The ceiling's painted figures looked down as if verifying a story they had been told long ago. That a woman who refused erasure had learned to turn absence into architecture, grief into a frame strong enough to hang the future upon. Her name rose, clear and whole, and she stood. Light gathered at her shoulders. Somewhere, a camera clicked with the solemnity of a new seal being pressed into wax. As she walked, she passed the edges of conversations that would, later, insist they had always believed in her. She did not slow for them. The stairs waited, and beyond them, a stage broad enough to carry both the history she owed and the future she had decided to own. She reached the wings. For the smallest moment, no more than the length of a heartbeat, Amara closed her eyes. Not to pray, but to listen, to the ghost rush of trains beyond the park, to the remembered rasp of a broom across concrete, to Desta's sure laughter and her mother's tender scold, to the hush that had filled the warehouse the night the artifacts learned their names again. Then she opened her eyes and stepped into the light. The applause struck the air like a wave breaking clean against rock, bright, unhesitating, rolling through the marble of the Metropolitan Museum with the force of something larger than celebration. Amara stood at the top of the stage steps, the light from the chandelier haloing her shoulders. For a heartbeat, it was only sound and warmth, and the sense that the night itself had paused to witness. When she reached the podium, the music fell away, leaving only the quiet hush of hundreds of people who once might have never learned her name. The award was simple, a glass sculpture shaped like a rising flame, elegant, fragile, unmistakably deliberate. A cultural leadership prize, the presenter had said, for transforming the boundaries of artistic heritage in this city. But she knew what it meant. It wasn't just a prize. It was a door opening, not because they had chosen to open it for her, but because she had built an entirely different house, and now the light from its windows was too bright to ignore. She placed her fingers around the base of the sculpture. It was cool, almost cold, like the surface of a lake just before dawn. Then she lifted her gaze. All around her, she saw faces. Faces that once turned away. Faces that whispered. Faces that measured her worth against a lineage that was not hers. But she also saw something new. Faces that glimmered with something warmer, less rehearsed. Recognition. Not the brittle kind that needs permission. The kind that happens when a truth finally finds its voice. Amara exhaled. When I was a little girl, she began, her voice soft but steady, my mother used to tell me that the world will always try to put your story in its own frame. It will crop your edges, mute your colors, and make your voice fit the space it already understands. And if you're not careful, she smiled faintly, you might begin to believe that that's all the world will ever see. She paused, letting the words gather weight. But here's the thing about stories. They are stubborn. They spill out of corners. They soak through walls. They rise from ashes even when the world says they shouldn't. And if you build a place big enough for them to live, those same walls that once shut you out will have no choice but to listen. A quiet murmur rippled across the room, an acknowledgement. Reluctant or reverent, it didn't matter. Amara continued, her gaze steady, no longer seeking approval, but meeting the eyes of those who had underestimated her. When the door closed behind me 2 years ago, I thought that was the end of my chapter. But it wasn't an ending. It was kindling. I built a space with the people who understood what it means to carry history in their bones. A space that didn't ask for permission. A space that didn't need their frames. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened, like a river cutting through stone. And tonight, I stand here not because I was welcomed back. I stand here because we proved we didn't need to ask to begin with. Somewhere in the crowd, Elliot shifted. She didn't need to see him to feel the moment land like snowfall. Quiet, irrevocable. She imagined him sitting at that table where once she might have sat as a guest. Now, she stood above it. She went on, her hands loosening around the glass flame. Power is not who lets you in. Power is knowing that you belong before anyone else dares to agree with you. It's creating something so undeniable, so achingly alive, that even those who tried to silence you must turn their heads to hear. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching her gown in a soft spill of gold. For an instant, she looked less like a guest of the gala and more like a storm passing through it. Elegant, uncontainable, necessary. She let the silence breathe again. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. This award is not just mine, she said finally. It belongs to every person who has ever been told they were too different, too loud, too dark, too much to belong. To every artist who carved their name into the air, even when no one would carve it into stone. To every woman who was told to wait for permission and built a door of her own instead. She lifted the glass flame slightly, not like a trophy, but like a lantern. We rise, she whispered, not because they let us, because we were always meant to. The audience rose, slowly at first, then fully, a standing ovation that wasn't about grandeur, but about inevitability. Applause rolled upward to the painted ceilings, to the marble gods and portraits in centuries-old columns, all of which seemed, at least for this brief night, to bend their attention toward her. Amara stepped back from the podium. Her heart was steady, quiet, not triumphant like fire, but radiant like heat that doesn't need to prove it can burn. She saw Desta's face near the back, glowing with pride. Her mother's hands were pressed together, trembling just slightly. And there, at a distance that no longer hurt, was Elliot. He was clapping. Not for himself, not for them, for her. Outside, the first snow of the night was beginning again, thin as silk. She walked through the revolving doors into the dark, cold brilliance of the city. The wind curled around her shoulders like a ribbon. The lights of Fifth Avenue didn't look down on her anymore. They met her where she stood. The night smelled like beginning. Somewhere behind her, the gala continued. Inside that room, power was still doing what power does, pretending it had invented her story. But she knew better. She had rewritten it, brick by brick, voice by voice, until the city itself whispered it back. She lifted her face to the snow, letting it settle softly against her lashes. The phoenix had not only risen, she had taken flight. If you've ever been told your story was too much, too complicated, or too different to matter, remember Amara's flame. Your voice is your power. If this story resonated with you, share it, leave your thoughts, and stay close for more stories that remind us that no matter how high the walls, we can build our own sky.